Today we have another special episode to be moderated by our managing editor, Jenn Webb. And our guest today is Simon Rodriguez. He is a data research assistant at CSET in Georgetown University. So take it away, Jenn Webb.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you, Simon, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So we're mostly going to be talking about publishing activity around the AI ML space based on a paper that you co-authored called Comparing Corporate and University Publication Activity in AI ML, which listeners can go get for free at the CSET website. And it was interesting when Ben brought this up. My immediate thought was, well, what difference does it make as long as the research is being done? Why does it matter so much who's doing it? And your paper was enlightening. I learned quite a lot reading that. So why don't we start by taking a look at why it's important, who's doing the research and who's doing the publishing in AI and ML.
Sure, definitely. I think it's important first because, first to sort of discuss the goal of CSET, Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. The end goal is always to sort of inform public policy. There are a lot of people who are currently working in public office who may not have a technical background, for better or worse. And so what we at CSAT like to do is sort of explain it through these briefs, issue briefs, data briefs, and sort of get it out there. So why it really matters as to who's doing the publishing is, first, it's about, incentivizing. It's about making sure that the US is on par with other countries in terms of publication activity when it comes to how well the universities are doing. You have this sort of preconception when you look at the US, sort of with FANG and everything, and a lot of major companies appearing to be the driving force towards AI and ML research. But, in actuality, these bigger companies are publishing less than, much smaller universities with a lot less funding. And it's important to understand the root causes of those if you really want to understand where the field is going and to accurately and appropriately allocate public resources towards those goods.
Okay, I do want to talk about some examples of policies, but Ben, you've done a bit of research into the activity in China versus the U.S. What thoughts do you have in this area?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I also have a lot of academic friends at the top CS programs in the U.S. And so there's always this pull towards industry because particularly in machine learning and AI, we're really talking about three key elements here, right? So big data, big compute, and big models. And, big data mostly resides in industry these days, honestly. And then compute, I think some universities may have access to big compute, but obviously not as we get to these bigger and bigger models, particularly in the language domain, it becomes really cost prohibitive. And for 4 years, I think, so I chaired conferences in China in big data and AI, and I was just struck by the amount of activity there, but somewhat also deceptive in some ways, Simon, because basically US is still a magnet. So if you look at the top conferences in computer science, there are a lot of Chinese researchers publishing there, but still dominated by US and Europe. And also, US still remains, I don't know how much of an impact the Trump policies had, but as best I can tell, the US still remains a magnet for grad students. Particularly from China. If you look at the top computer science programs in the US, a lot of grad students are from China. And the US has this incredible track record for retaining that talent once they graduate here. So far, I think the stat I saw was 90% of the people who graduated at the top CS programs end up staying in the US. But obviously, that can change over time, right? So, and yeah, in terms of industry versus academia, just there's also the compensation aspect, right? So, particularly if you can start a company, um, and that company becomes successful, uh, there's just a lot of incentive to consider going on sabbatical or even giving up your tenure. And also, I mean, I think in industry, if you have the right position, you end up working on basically research level projects essentially full time, right? So
Right.
yeah, without having to raise grant money.
Definitely. And to sort of add to that, we worked on another paper at CSET, focusing sort of on patent activity, which is a bit more indicative of the sort of space in industry. Uh, as you know, China, even with its university and private industry, but they're very strong ties to government. Whereas here in the U.S., patents aren't necessarily tied to government projects. There's not as big of a barrier to sort of publicize it and sort of make it yours, like you mentioned, for your own sort of project and industry, which I think is also an important point to consider.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the extent that what makes what Simon and his team what they're doing is interesting is to the extent that particularly AI and machine learning, a lot of the activity really comes down to, in many ways, two countries, right? So U.S. and China.
Right.
So it becomes uh, easier in many ways to track uh, this race between these two countries. Um, and to the extent that in many ways it comes down to publishing at these top conferences, patent activity. Maybe I don't know, Simon. Do you guys also look at startup activity and funding and things like this?
There are definitely trackers for funding. Refinitiv is a data set used a lot by CSET people. Personally, that's outside of my field of writing, but there's definitely publications under CSET that do heavily involve tracking these sort of startup fields.
Because in my mind, when I think about these things, Jen, what are the metrics that are interesting? So publication,
Right.
patents. I like to look at job postings to see, for example, this line of research was hot 6 months ago. So is it starting to show up in job ads?
Right.
And then startup activity.
Right. And
Right.
sorry to cut you off here, Jen, but
No, go ahead.
just to bring up citations about publications.
Right.
We also do look into a now increasing more popular sort of research metric known as alt metric. I'm sure people in the research field have sort of seen this alt metric to garner things more than just traditional citation. We're in the age of social media where people are sharing information left and right, and the scientific community has sort of picked up on that. Be it YouTube videos about popular articles or even tweets. That's something that's measured now, and the vast amounts of metadata generated by these major social media sites regarding how much effect a certain publication has is startling.
Right. And so, well, since we're talking about the data that you looked at, can you share, like, specifically where you got your data and what kinds
Sure.
of data you did look at for this particular paper?
Sure. So for the particular paper we're talking about here, comparing AI ML publications, we used data source called Dimensions. It's a pretty big popular sort of open source data repository, which has and the reason we use it is because it has such strong ties. It follows the grid AI system. So these classifiers, it makes it so easy to say, oh, this is a publication from Google Canada, this is a publication from Google Ecuador. These aren't fully concrete examples, but just to sort of give you um, an idea of how many small companies publish under Google. And Dimensions does a really, really swell job of making sure that attribution is strongly connected if it's from a parent organization. And Dimensions is a huge data set, huge. It links citations to publications to patents to databases used, and even includes Altmetric, which is a huge database in and of itself. So really, this data set, dimensions, if you Google dimensions data, it'll pop up there. It's this huge data set, and there's a lot you can learn from it, and a lot that can be discovered just by seeing the vast amounts of data.
And who maintains it?
um uh, I believe they have their own team, who Dimensions AI maintains it. But I need the citation needed there.
And so what did you find? What were ultimately, who is publishing more?
So surprisingly, universities are publishing a lot more, in terms of
Why is that surprising?
counts. It's surprising. Personally, obviously going to data, you like to have a clear mind, but there are these preconceptions you have going in, and the reason a lot of people are um, drawn to wanting to work for big tech companies is, oh, these people are at the forefront of innovation, and in a lot of ways they definitely are. I mean, publication count isn't the takeaway from the mass amounts these major tech companies are doing for the industry, but you'd think in the research field that would show. Obviously you think private companies with much larger resources than universities would have much larger publication counts. But the research shows that it isn't true. And instead of either university or company really dominating the publication field, it's more of actually companies working with universities, oftentimes with several universities at a time for these publications. And yeah.
So are the universities approaching the companies, or the companies approaching the universities?
While we don't have sort of records of their communication, from what we've seen so far, it's a big part of it is a sort of partnership. So you see outreach on both sides. Oftentimes, um, universities, if they need funding, um,
Right.
funding's hard to get. we all know, sort
Sure.
of in the academic field, but oftentimes companies also incentivize certain research and look for research in specific fields they're interested in, and if that aligns with the research, um, communication can happen both ways.
Right.
So
There's probably proprietary issues too about, so what did you find anything that indicated why companies publish less? Was it more of a proprietary issue, a hurdle that way, or are they just really doing less research?
actually, I want to push back on this notion first before he answers.
Okay. Oh, sure, sure. Go ahead,
I
James.
think that Simon, I would say what you said is probably true overall, but I think if you look at, and I'm just going by what I know from New Reps. I think if you go to the top CS conferences, it's probably companies dominate, right? So if you go to just the top conferences like New Reps, ICML, ICLR. I think that companies are either publish more or at least competitive with the universities. But of course, if you look at overall, there's so many places that people publish, and I'm not sure
Well, then
what the answer
that
is.
could be too, right? I mean, this is something I was going to talk about a little bit later in our conversation, but going back to Simon's point earlier about citations, right? So the publishing, one of the things that came out in the paper is that while universities might be publishing more, when companies publish, they get more citations. So it could be that what the companies are, and also with the companies having more money, maybe what they're working on is a little bit larger in scope. So maybe that's the reason why they're being featured at these conferences, is because they get a little bit more voice behind their work. I don't, Simon, what do you think?
Or they're more selective in some ways, because they're not their incentive structure may not be as aligned with publications as the professors are, right? So in other words, if you do something big, you submit it to the top conferences, but some of the other things you do, you don't bother to write up, right? So.
Definitely. And to speak more to what you were inquiring about, Jen, we've been doing some exploratory research on sort of what indicates more sort of public consciousness. What informs more about public consciousness when it comes to paper? Is it pure citation activity? Because as we all know, that's very biased to what is relevant to the academic field. But as to what's relevant to people in a general sense, would that mean altmetric citation? So we sort of explore those two, and what that tells us is there are these, as you said, Ben, huge companies that are very dominant in all the IEE conferences and things like that. But when we see how that affects the public conscious, how many people are tweeting about it, how many people are talking about it on YouTube, it's substantially less than these more niche papers. And whether that's because more university scholars are intentionally reaching out with their work online, more people who publish in university know that there is no dedicated marketing team to getting their information out there, so they have to generate discussion about their own work. And as a researcher, and I'm sure y'all can relate, it's good to feel like your work is getting the recognition due to you when you put in the work. And I think that validation is seen in many different ways now, not only through traditional citation counts, but also through everything on social media, everything on other outlets of attention. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, so for example, if you're at Google, Facebook, or one of these places and you publish a paper, first it'll show up in the page where your company lists all the published papers, but how many people visit that page, right? So not many. So I think, so the ways that these industrial research papers really get known is, one, either they really improve some benchmark so much so that the mainstream press covers them in an article, or it's something novel that a mainstream reporter will cover it. Or actually, honestly, I don't know how you feel about this, Simon, but some of these companies also have been very effective in terms of writing generally accessible blog posts about their research, right? So they will say, so here's a blog post about this new research work we did. It's still technical, but not very technical. And then they'll point you to the paper and the code. But that's how, I mean, I think that those blog posts have been quite effective for companies.
Yeah, definitely. And another thing to consider is a lot of times, when other researchers are looking for information, some person from, let's say, Fordham University, my alma mater, wouldn't pop up as much as just the name Google. If you're looking for sources, if you're looking for things you can trust, and not to say, Fordham's any less trustworthy than Google, I hope not. But it's something that pops out. It's the sort of to use a sort of millennial term, the clout garnered by having a big name attached to the paper. And this also incentivizes universities to want to work with major companies, because otherwise their research could go under noticed or even unnoticed. They're in the database dimensions and in altmetrics, there are tons and tons of gigabytes of data of papers that just never get even a single citation, even a single read. And that's because, they don't have the Google pulling for them. They don't have the Amazon attached to their name, and which is
Don't
a
don't they know that they can pay $10 for social media amplification? You can buy Twitter followers. And by the way, Simon, is there a formal description of what you're terming altmetric?
altmetric, it's a data set in and of itself. They have various fields and a very specific thing called an altmetric score, as to
So what goes into the score?
right. So altmetric makes use of, from what I know, that to those who have not used the technology before, if you search up altmetric, they have wonderful infographics on what goes into them. But from working with it personally, it includes things from even Reddit, Twitter, YouTube, popular news citations, and just general mentions throughout the web. And it even goes on to see how many people have it saved on a certain website, have subscribed to this paper.
So you start out with the title of a paper,
Right.
and then you can. I see.
And where altmetric is strong in connecting is with its DOI or PMID. It tracks that very well across the sort of popular internet attention. And it's I think, while it is a sort of nuanced way to look at attention garnered, I think combining altmetric and traditional citation counts can give you a more insightful look as to who's really looking at the paper at a given time.
So getting back a little bit to the citation, not so much the citations, but the influence and the clout that companies have in this publishing question of private labs and universities versus companies. You talked early on, one of the reasons why this is an important topic is the effect on policy decisions. So what are the implications of big companies having the big influence and that kind of influencing policy decisions? And what sorts of things did you notice in that area? Like,
Sure.
what kinds of policies are being affected and in what ways?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, personally, the field of policy on tech is very reactionary in nature. We see this when it comes to laws instituted, when it comes to what the government chooses to focus on. And that could, a case can be made as to that holding true as to all public policy. A lot of it is reactionary, but when it comes to the field of AI and ML and tech in general, being reactionary sometimes, isn't enough. Sometimes you have to be proactive, especially in terms of, cybersecurity and its impact on the greater community. But still, we see that in public policy, even in the past 2 years, a lot of proposed bills, a lot of proposed policy about AI, and I can tell you, California and New Jersey, these states have proposed policy to make AI more transparent when used within the government, and that's very important and very relevant. But all these have been immediately shot down, and we see this again and again because again there was no, I mean, there are breaches left and right, but there is no disaster that struck to make people realize the ramifications. Like what's going on in Texas right now, with the snow. Now they're gonna probably instill infrastructure to deal with snow as an issue. But now it's sort of too late. People are going powerless and things like that. But while scientists can make claims about whether this we as researchers know sort of what the trends are, and if we only pay attention to what's popular, and what the industry is focusing on, you know, um, Google's not really incentivized to protect user data. As much as as much as the EU's constraints make it have to protect data, it's not their primary goal. But if you have
Right.
policymakers following Google's primary goal, then you forget about protecting the anonymity of people, making sure that the algorithms used to monitor things through the government aren't harming anyone or aren't being discriminatory in its practices. And I think that's why it's important to look at it in a grand scale, um, especially when it comes to research and knowing what's recent and knowing what trends public people who make public policy need to be viewing at a certain time.
Right.
So I
Ben, you're
think,
reading a book related to this right now.
yeah, and at a high level, I think AI and machine learning, even policymakers at this point, I think for the last several years have come to realize are going to be so fundamental that you have to really not cede any sort of competitive advantage to your geopolitical rivals, right? Um, so I think of it again in terms of these three building blocks: of big data, big compute, big models, right? So big data. It seems like this is now, Simon. I don't know how you feel. So I think almost every region in the world has realized data is at the heart of this competition. So we need some kind of control over. I don't know what the term is, data nationalism. So
Right.
let's keep the data inside our border. So that's what's happening in the data world.
Yeah,
Uh,
data localization is
yeah,
a
data localization. Yeah. And then big compute. Well, I mean, that's playing out right now with the semiconductor uh, competition between China and the US, right? And then big models is all this kind of publication and innovation around the models themselves. But I think also in the big data realm, you would think you can see how it's playing out in terms of uh, acquiring data, right? So 5G. So 5G is another point of contention and competition. So uh, and as you point out, Jen, information security, right?
Mhm.
Which I think in a few years we'll look back and realize information security has now been encapsulated by data security. So almost all of information security is about protecting data. Um, but uh, I think that to the extent that most policymakers at this point realize that all of these components are important, uh, I I think there's much more sense of urgency now. Whether or not uh, the U.S. political system or the European political system is can come up with policies that are sound and not overreaching, that's a separate question, right? Because
right.
Right.
you still want people to innovate at some point, right? So
Well, to that point, Ben, and this is a really a question for both of you because Ben, you've had experience in DC, but what's the practical way to change how this is all working? So how can we get these maybe more pointed research, maybe, not so much from the companies, but just in general, how can we get the important research and the relative research into the hands of the policymakers? So let's start with Simon.
Sure. I think there's sort of a two-part thing, right? One is making the research accessible. As Ben said, Google does a really good job of sort of not dumbing down, but making it
Mhm.
understandable for a broader audience. Bluff, making sure the important parts are highlighted, sort of skipping through the analysis and saying this is what the conclusion is, this is what you need to take away from this type of technology, this type of research. I think that's important to get to the policymakers. But another thing is, we need a lot more policymakers to have sort of even rudimentary background in tech, because tech moves so fast. Having sort of younger people who are more acquainted in the technology, and even there's a huge disparity with tech majors not being in politics. A lot of times people become data engineers and data analysts, and obviously that's what they study, but what that means for the sort of general field of public policy when no one understands what a blockchain is. When we saw that the Mark Zuckerberg, when he talked in front of, I believe, the Senate at the time, we saw the types of questions being asked, and as a viewer, as someone who uh understand some of the ramifications of data, you need to drill a lot deeper than sort of the questions that are being asked, the questions that are being probed. I think having an understanding is the responsibility also of the policymakers to actively seek to understand these new technologies and what it means for the people who put them in.
Yeah, and I think that actually, places like CSET, we need more places where it's uh, uh, it's about tech policy, but driven by data and nonpartisan, right? So,
So a
much,
data-driven lobby.
yeah, much more, real analysis, right? So analysis, but uh, not purely based on opinion, but based somewhat on data. That's why CSET always struck me as a interesting place. But and also, I think we need probably, and I don't know how to do it in the U.S. The U.S. is a tough place, but some more cooperation between private and public sector. I don't. So by that I mean, in the U.S. you're either in the public sector or the private sector, but in other countries maybe people go back and forth more often. You know, um, here basically, like for me, for example, Silicon Valley, you just stay in Silicon Valley. You go from company to company, right? So there's no but most of the knowledge, as I think Simon will agree, in tech probably right now resides in people who work in the private sector, but they need to kind of somehow spend like a year working in the public sector somehow. But I don't know how to implement that, right? So
Right. And so, Simon, looking at your paper overall and the time you spent on that, what you talked a little bit about the fact that companies were publishing less being surprising, but what other sorts of things did you preconceptions did you go in with that you were surprised by the data that came out, and what were some of like the biggest takeaways for you? What was most impactful for you?
Sure. Honestly, what was most impactful was an overview of just the raw counts. You know, um, like smaller universities in the Midwest, have 10, 20 times the publication activity of Amazon. And, these are places, personally, having gone through the college hunt in the US, even I haven't heard of. And, to get these publications across, I think this is also prevalent sort of in the US culture is universities are not necessarily publication mills. It's not just publications for the sake of having publications. While that culture sort of exists somewhere in all data fields, I feel like the research is quality research, but the attention is not given as much to them, at least in when it comes to traditional citation counts.
Where are they publishing? Like, what kinds of places did you find them publishing?
So in terms of what garners attention, like what Ben said, Nature and
Well, sure, but no,
right,
I
right,
mean these little universities. Where are they publishing their stuff?
right. So they're publishing on a lot more niche fields. And the thing with the university research is it's not quite as pointed as I'd say company papers. There are a lot more fields they can be published as in just the computer science space. You have a lot of publications that, yes, make use of AI and ML, but are used in plant biology or different fields like that. And I think because it's so broad in scope, you know, um, that in itself reveals to you just how important AI and ML is that it's applicable in so many different fields, as evidenced by all these papers that's being published in non-computer science journals, non-computer science publications, and which also highlights two people within fields. Like, let's say, if you're a marine biologist, if you see that AI ML is now being used in your field, what does that mean for the future of your field? We like to say that AI ML is the future of tech, but is it also the future of medicine? That's being brought up a lot. And is it also the future of zoology? Who knows what it's
or digital humanities, right?
right. Right. Definitely. And cyber ethics is a huge deal now. And understanding the sort of what sort of ethics need to be followed by cyberspace should be when it comes to data ownership, anonymity, the person as they extend to their online presence and online persona. These are questions that also need to be asked to people making the laws. Like, um, the Wiretap Act sort of extended that to whether or not people's phone records are extensions of their person, and thus extension of, I believe, the Fourth Amendment, right? But does that extend to, let's say, someone's Reddit posts? Um, can the government get that without warrant? While there hasn't been significant legislation at that point, that's something to consider about data ownership and person ownership, how that extends sort of to this digital era we're in now.
Right. That's related to something else I was curious about. Did you notice any difference in the kinds of research that companies are publishing versus universities? Is it just like a, I don't know, maybe more, are companies publishing more mainstream popular sorts of things, or what did you find in that area?
I think that's a sort of hard question to answer because it's usually what companies publish become mainstream. Whether it was prior to that is
Right,
something that's
sure.
to be explored. But um that's sort of how we also qualify as that they are the leaders in the space, even if they're not the leaders in publication. What people
Mhm.
view as, oh, this is where the industry is heading, isn't rooted in what hundreds of universities are publishing about. It's rooted in that um one out of the 20 publications Facebook will publish this year, um that's what defines sort of where we're going. So I'd say, yes, it becomes more mainstream stuff, but as to how much of that is because they define what is the mainstream, I think it becomes blurred in that sense.
Right. Ben, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and also I think that to a large extent, AI and ML research, the main, I would say, the main uh, metric they're optimizing is to improve on some benchmark, right?
Hmm.
And so that's where a lot of the articles get written about, right? So this language model is a lot more accurate than the previous one, right? And in that race, it's somewhat of an arms race, and so there the companies have an advantage usually. Uh, US and Chinese companies, uh, and so a lot of the things that Simon is describing, which is more on the application side, I think companies do a lot of that too, but they're it's unless there's something specific, it seems like there it's a little more level playing field, right? Because it's not so much of an arms race. Although I think that to the extent that if your application involves something complex like going across multiple clouds or mobile devices and doing some clever encryption or whatever, then the companies may still have an advantage. But by the way, so that our listeners don't spam me with email, I'm not saying that this is only just U.S. and China. Obviously, Europe has a lot of good work in this area as well, right? So, I mean, DeepMind being one. Obviously, DeepMind is now part of Google. But another country that stands out, obviously, is Israel, right? So, a lot of interesting things there. But in 2019, I was involved with a paper with the World Intellectual Patent Office, and they looked at patent filings all over the world. And the caveat here is patents are obviously kind of a flawed metric. But there, I mean, one thing that popped out, I don't know if you're seeing this, Simon, but there are companies in East Asia that have great patent metrics in certain areas like robotics. So this by this I mean specifically Japan and Korea, because they have also a long tradition of industry innovation in things that involve hardware and robotics, right?
Right.
Particularly robotics in industry, I think Japan is quite leading edge, right? So.
Right. And I think that that brings up an interesting point as to how much these are sort of tied with culture, right? Like as much as the US does have this strong private presence, is it like what is it rooted at as its base? Is it will this make us more profitable in the end? These are sort of the sort of benchmarks of these advancements will mean our technology will surpass our competitors. Whereas in China, we see state-run universities focusing patent research on computer vision. As to why, it's in popular news now how involved China's government is becoming in pursuing sort of computer vision technology to use as monitoring. Which is sort of antithetical to how the average American views the sort of big brother look of surveillance. So, you know, does it then come at the cost of the US to de-incentivize surveillance things if it falls behind on computer vision technology, because more Americans sort of want to maintain their privacy? Is it worth it then to say, okay, Google, Facebook, Amazon, do not touch these technologies? And we've seen that a year and a half ago. A lot of companies have sort of sworn off or at least took a step back from these facial recognition technologies. But what does that mean for national security in that space in the future? I think it's hard to tell.
Actually, Jen, this raises a good point because basically, if you think about computer vision, right? So and facial recognition, right? So it's one thing for U.S. researcher or U.S. company to say, "Hey, we topped the benchmark. We have the best computer vision model." But what Simon is describing is when you get down to implementation at scale in systems that have to work all the time, there's no substitute other than doing it. So if the Chinese are doing it now at scale, they're exporting this technology to countries in Africa and Latin America. They're just getting a lot of implementation and practical knowledge that even though the US companies may still have the best models, but model is just one part of a system, right? So of an application stack. By the way, I don't know, Simon, if you folks at CSET are looking at this, but one thing that fascinates me is there's so much activity now around space technologies, right? So we're recording this the day after the Mars rover landed. A lot of it is actually public-private partnership, but in the past, investments in space technology have translated to commercial applications years down the road. So it'll be fascinating to see if any of these investments will make it to industry much faster, given that industry is much closely involved now, right? So
Right, and I while I don't think CSET particularly has a focus on this, as it sort of is focused on the where we're lagging behind now instead of sort of where we're ahead. I think space exploration, space travel, while it's sort of at the forefront of everyone's minds, there are also sort of these benchmarks that we're missing right now when it comes to data privacy, when it comes to cloud security. It was only last year, or 2 years ago, even if it was under the Trump administration, when someone was finally held, named accountable. All the agency heads were named accountable for the cybersecurity of their organization. Which is, the fact that it took this long to become explicit in the law says something that's sort of concerning. One, that people didn't realize it was their jobs already. We have NIST for a lot of these practical reasons, and NIST and the wonderful work that they do with NIST um, become sort of obfuscated by people not using their frameworks, and people not feeling like their frameworks are suggestions. And though NIST frameworks are sort of in the data architecture world are just that, frameworks, and not exactly enforceable. It's important to keep up to date because there are data breaches happening every day. Um, there are ramifications for not keeping up with this technology. You can't just make this huge jump in a day, a month, a year. It takes long. It takes a continued level of alertness. And I think this is why we need to be mindful, and public policymakers need to be mindful as to what the current research is. It's important not to lag behind.
and companies increasingly have to contend in the information security space. Companies have to contend with nation state actors, right? So,
Right.
Sure. So before we close, Simon, I'm curious, what are you working on now? What are you researching at the moment?
Sure. So right now we're researching sort of what the AI ML space looked like in non-tech hubs. So he said that this publication about AI hubs and obviously the coastal cities. You have San Jose, San Francisco, New York. So we want to sort of see whether these jobs that exist in these coastal cities exist in these Midwest cities, in places in developing areas like Austin, where you have a growing sort of computer science set and level of talent. So yeah, while it's too early to really make any predictions on our data, it's pretty exciting to sort of view the sort of new to see where the nation's developing in terms of its artificial intelligence spaces and talent.
and what data sources are you using? Is it job postings?
Uh, yes. So a lot of what we're using now, we're using Burning Glass data. Burning Glass collates and has its own way of classifying and defining jobs that we find extremely straightforward to use. Yeah.
And then so what so you're looking at kind of the top metropolitan areas based on census data. Is that kind of
Um, right. So sort of what we're looking at right now is where these jobs exist first. So we have a I also have a cat roaming around here. So I'm glad to see another cat on the screen. Um, but we're using the data sort of to find out first where these jobs are, then qualify whether or not these are the same jobs we're looking at, whether Austin's an entirely different hub. Maybe one of these smaller non-tech cities happen to be a breeding place for computer vision. We don't know yet. And that's sort of exciting, sort of this exploratory research into that field.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Simon. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It was lovely meeting both of you. And thank you for the work that you do.